Howdy, y'all. Welcome back to another episode of Rednecks Rising, your favorite anti-capitalist, anti-fascist, anti-racist Appalachian podcast, hosted by yours truly, Chelsea. That's me. If you're new here, welcome, my friends. Make yourself comfortable. In this podcast, we dig into topics related to everything Appalachian, our history, our culture, all in between episodes where I sit down with hell-raising hillbillies from up and down the mountain range who are doing fantastic work in mutual aid, community building, movie making, storytelling, and so much more. In today's episode, you'll be hearing a conversation that I had back in mid-October with Andy from the Prole's Almanac. Another great podcast that you should absolutely check out if you're not already listening to them. And if you happen to find your way here via our amazing memes on Instagram, well, Prole's also happens to have top-notch memes, so make sure to go give them a follow as well. In our conversation today, Andy tells us about his own history with sustainable agricultural practices and gives us a friendly reminder that food systems require communal contributions. Whether it's homesteading, prepping, all those things require cooperative existence. We talk about the similarities between permaculture and social work as fields of academia that perpetuate individualistic approaches over the real systemic communal solutions that are ultimately combating this myth of scarcity. We talk about community as an efficient solution and a sustainable solution to issues of survival, thriving, and well-being overall. And we also talk about the real challenge of building authentic relationships with the imperfect communities that exist around us today rather than the imaginary perfect communities that we wish we lived among. We talk about meeting those community members where they're at and having empathy for our shared trauma responses under this white supremacist capitalist culture that we've inherited. And of course, we discuss the so many overlaps between permaculture, ecology, foraging, and community organizing / social work that I just had not even thought about before. But before we jump into the episode for today, we got a little bit of business to take care of. So first things first, I want to give a big, warm welcome and shout out to our newest friends of the podcast, our newest Rednecks Rising, Andrew P. and Keisha. Thank y'all so much for your support and all the love. If you are listening to this and you enjoy what you hear on the show and you want to support us in being able to produce content consistently and cover even more topics that you're excited to hear about or to sit down with folks that you really want to hear from, the best ways to support us are, number one, head over to our Patreon alternative, which is Ko-Fi or Coffee. I don't care how you say it. It's KO, like knockout -fi.com/rednecks rising. It's plural, Rednecks Rising. Throw a tip our way or become a monthly contributor to the show. Every little bit helps. The second way you can support us is to follow us on your preferred social channels. We are Rednecks Rising on TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram, and make sure to share us with your friends so they can hear about us too. And the third way to support us is to reach out to us if you or someone that you know has something that you want to talk about or amplify on the show. We especially want to amplify the work and voices of Appalachians who hold other identities that have been historically underrepresented, such as Black Appalachians, Indigenous Appalachians, other Appalachians of color, queer Appalachians, Appalachians with disabilities, and so on. Over on that Ko-Fi page, you can also find some really sick merch, if I do say so myself, for yourself or for some redneck friend or family member just in time for the holiday season. Your monetary contributions go towards, first and foremost, helping me to keep this show alive because I am a working class mom, and believe it or not, there are costs associated with producing broadly accessible content, and half of what's left over after we cover the cost of production, half of what's left over is contributed towards a group of folks on the ground in Appalachia. Like our first round of contributions went to our friends at the Pulaski County Free Store, folks like the East Kentucky Mutual Aid, and other good folks. And that said, I do believe that really carries us through the brunt of this week's housekeeping notes. We were keeping it short and simple this week, so I think that we are ready for our trivia question of the day.
Hey, Chelsea.
Hey, Chris.
Since we were talking about permaculture, I thought it appropriate to ask. It was developed in Australia in the 70s by Bill Mollinson and David Holmgren, but what year did they officially coin the phrase permaculture? I can do it.
Episodes of the podcast, but let's assume that whoever's listening to this has never listened to Prole's Almanac before. I would love to just start by having you introduce yourself and tell us who you are.
Yeah, so my name is Andy. I am the host of the Prole's Almanac, a podcast about what happens after we don't do anything. So as things go on, how do we deal with that situation, and how do we deal with the fact that the systems that we've had to keep us alive, keep our communities alive, when those don't exist, what are we doing, and what should we be doing, and how do we look to the past to start thinking about what kind of sustainable systems have been in place before?
I love that. I've talked on my show a little bit about the concept. There's this framework of the 4 R's of how to actually enact a just transition. And it's resist, reform, reimagine, and recreate. And I feel like you're really talking about the recreating, how do we actually create systems for ourselves outside of these systems? It's kind of like the strike funds that are necessary to keep the workers alive while they lose their income in order to demand a better world and build a better world for themselves. And what are the containers that we can actually hold ourselves in while we're also resisting capitalism and trying to dismantle what's clearly not working for us. Love that concept. How did this show come to life, and how'd you get involved? What's the story behind that?
Sure. So 2.5 years, actually, in 10 days, 2 years ago, 10 days ago. Let me try that again. 2 years plus 10 days ago. There we go. A friend of mine, me and my co-host Elliot, had passed away unexpectedly, and he lived 10, 12 hours from us. So we got in a car, hadn't seen each other in, 10 years, 8 years, something like that. And drove down to Maryland. We're just kind of shooting the shit, talking about stuff, and the fact that it seems like everything's kind of unraveling. And this was, 5 months before COVID. And we were both yeah, things don't seem like they're getting better. And he was just basically I think people want to hear about this. And I was no one wants to hear about this. And then, we came home, talked about it a couple times, didn't do anything. And then COVID hit, and it was okay, maybe we should do this thing. We should talk about these things. And that's kind of where it came from.
What were you I'm curious about so the way that I ended up following your content was through the specifically the what's the word for it? The urban when you plant wild seeds.
Guerrilla gardening.
Yeah, guerrilla gardening. That kind of content specifically on Instagram. And I'm based out of Western North Carolina in the Appalachian Mountains, not in Asheville, but that's the closest place that I usually refer to. But I am in a small apartment complex, and because of your content, I started noticing which pieces of our landscaping were they had little fruits that I had never seen before growing on them. And I was is this edible? What is this? Where does this come from? Which are things that I had never asked myself before. And so I'm just curious, what you were doing before the podcast, and what it was that drew your attention to. I mean, obviously things were not getting better, but I feel not everybody's come to that conclusion yet. And so what was it that you were kind of doing with your time prior to this that led to this specifically being the thing that you wanted to put energy into?
I've been around like the regenerative, whatever permaculture type movement for 12 years now, 12, 15 years, something like that. And I've kind of covered this, and even in making the podcast, my position on it has kind of evolved. But basically, I'd been around these like food foresty, food systems conversations for a number of years, and it didn't seem like any of it was ever scalable, which wasn't necessarily a problem, but everything was hyper individualized. Permaculture is really individual, right? Like people never talk about community, or if they do talk about community food forests or whatever, it's never to actually feed a community. It's like so a couple dozen people can like get some fruit, or a couple hundred pounds of nuts or something like that. It's not covering all of those food needs for people. And as I was doing this, I started thinking about, well, how do we deal with that? My biggest thing was gripe was like thinking about like, the urban like urban farms and things like that. And like those are really like attractive to people, especially as like internet content, right? You get these snippets of, look at this garden in, XYZ city. It feeds 500 people or whatever. It gives food to 500 people. It does not feed 500 people. And there's a very important difference, because historically, whenever we've talked about growing food, at least when I say historically, I mean like the last couple hundred years, it's always existed with like the staples being covered by outside resources. When people talk about my grandmother during the Great Depression grew all of her food, she probably didn't grow her own grains. She probably, that flour, or even like the seed came from somewhere else, probably, because to grow everything is just a lot of work. And there's a reason why, the homesteaders on YouTube and so on don't have full-time jobs, because you can't do both. And even then they're still supplementing their diets, right? And there's nothing wrong with that except for the presentation of it. And that piece of it, the how do we talk about growing food and food systems without fully comprehensively thinking about what our food actually is, always really bugged me. Because when we talk about like prepping and, again, homesteading, it's like, yeah, you can do all these things, but you're not addressing the 40% of your diet that's carbs or protein, right? That's the hard part. And even if you're raising your own protein, you're raising chickens or whatever, how much of their diet is ultimately corn, or soy, or whatever it might be? And there's nothing inherently wrong with feeding them that, but if we're thinking about systems, and we're thinking about the infrastructural changes that are going to happen under climate change and late stage capitalism, those things that's not a solution, right? You can't just say, I've got a dozen chickens or 2 dozen chickens in my backyard. Where's their food coming from if you can't go to the food store anymore? And that's been like the thing that's always kind of bugged me, like a scab, like that's trying to heal. And as we started this project, it was more of, how do we address that? How do we think about that? How do we center that piece of the conversation so people get off of this idea of, I'm going to go plant some celery in my, urban, neighborhood. And like, there's nothing wrong with that, but also think about the bigger picture, the important stuff here, right?
Yes, I'm like leaning back because I'm like, I'm just at church right now. Thank you so much. I mean, my background is in community organizing for like a decade, and I mean, academically speaking, like where you come from, like permaculture, I come from social work, but always through that lens of like, there is no individual thriving. Like an individual cannot thrive without like collective thriving and input. Like there's so much more that goes into an individual being able to thrive. And so it took me into like, I couldn't do clinical work. Like I couldn't do this one-on-one level of like therapy or counseling that a lot of social workers like tend to go into. Is like, I have to go into the community level and like figure out, how do we remove barriers to thriving for as many people as possible? Like go upstream, stop the source of the pain and the suffering and the struggling and the disconnection and isolation. And so one of the things that, it's so funny that you were talking about, I guess it's not funny, it's actually not coincidental at all, and I appreciate your analysis, is like the individualism specifically in permaculture and like prepping and like homesteading cultures. Like for one, so I'm running this kind of like learning group that's dedicated to like community organizing, like folks who like want to learn how to community organize, but there's a lot of barriers to entry, similar to how there are in permaculture, and like just getting the knowledge and like understanding how it works, et cetera. And one of my support folks, Scarlett, who's helping with tech, because that's not my forte, is also comes from permaculture and like that background. And we were talking about the characteristics of white supremacist capitalism culture, or white supremacy culture. And there's like this whole assessment. And one of the characteristics is individualism. And Scarlett like pulled that one out and like talked about it in permaculture specifically, and like how much of a barrier it is. And so I just appreciate that surfaced here in this discussion too. And that more folks, I think, at least with like kind of our shared values and like worldview, are starting to surface these things and figure out, okay, well, how do we do this? Even if like the rest of the permaculture like community or the rest of the social work community, et cetera, is like not leaning into it in the same way. How do we do what we can with what we have so that we can change this culture? And for me also, it's like, so I also bring a lens of just like really struggling economically my whole life, growing up poor, like still like being on like one paycheck away from on the streets, at any given point. And so for me, I also think about just like how capitalism keeps us in this loop of like, because so much of like the staples are provided under capitalism, and then we end up having to like work for the capitalist machine to get those staples. It's like it keeps us trapped in this feedback loop of like there's no time or resources to like invest in getting your own 10 chickens. It's like if you have to work 2 jobs in order to just maintain a roof over your head right now, then like how are you going to learn what goes into even like entering this individualist idea of like self-sufficiency, because it's like you would have to have some resources to start with to like be able to invest in that. And it just having this more communal idea, like is similar to like how I see community organizing and around like removing the barriers to like more people participating also means that we can all get more out of it. And that more people participating means more people can participate. Like it's the opposite feedback loop. And for like someone like me, like I do not have a green thumb, and like but my partner is an amazing, always has kept like a sort of like patio level garden for us. And I just think about how like important it would be for me in this like post late stage capitalist apocalyptic world to have community with people who do have that skill, and like figure out what skill and like support that I can offer in exchange, because that's how we end up surviving and thriving, like food and beyond, right? Like supporting each other with childcare and like education and like knowledge and shared wisdom. And even like the foraging side of it. It's like some folks are really good at growing, some folks are good at going out foraging. And then some folks are good at like the preservation. And so it's like all of those, like you were saying, it's like a full-time job, like and no one person. And historically speaking, we haven't evolved this far with like one person being able to do all of the things that it takes to like survive.
Yeah. And like I think about like my own self, like we project these values, and then you think about like I look at my own property, and I have sheep, I have ducks, I have chickens, I do composting, I have an indoor garden, I do my own starts for my annual vegetable garden. I have all these different things. Some of them I'm good at, some of them I'm not really good at because I don't care, and some of them it's just I'm not bad at them, but it's so low on my list, by the time I get to it I'm just kind of like, yeah, whatever, like screw it, like I'm just gonna half-ass it. And it's like, if I was just doing the things I liked and I was focused on one area, you think about like that the cost of transitioning to different activities. And like one of the things we really struggle with is when we talk about like how we build community, is that we have a really good argument for efficiency, but we don't like to talk in those terms, right? Like if I am the sheep guy, just for example, I live in a community, I'm the sheep guy. I know those sheep back and forth. I know where to put the fence posts. I know where the roots are in the ground when I'm putting fence posts in, because I've been doing that for however many years, right? If I'm going to my compost pile and I'm turning it, I'm not going to pick up something that somebody else would. I might not have those skills. Just that physical action of walking over to the compost pile instead of just doing my specific job is a loss of efficiency. And there's so much efficiency built into being able to scale what you're doing. If I'm moving fence, you know, you think about like the circumference of an area, right? When it gets bigger, the circumference doesn't change at the same rate as the square footage, right? So like you make a 10 by 10, there's 40 square feet around it. 100 by 100 is 400 square feet. That's a 10 times gain, but the 10 by 10 space is 100 square feet. 100 by 100 is 1,000 square feet. Did I do that right? Maybe, I don't know. Point being that like as we scale up, there's scale, the efficiency of scale, right? And me being there and putting fence posts in and walking an extra 10 feet and another 10 feet versus going to the other side of the property and going to move a bucket of compost or whatever it might be. There's so much energy lost when we individualize these things. And when we start talking about what these systems look like, that's where we need to start pointing out it's not just because I believe in community, not because I think everyone shouldn't have to do everything, but also there's this very real measurable efficiency that goes with that process, right? And that's the part I think we need to do a better job of communicating and also actualizing in our day-to-day activities, which is really difficult because ultimately that means working with the community that's around you today, not some ideological community in the future. And that's really difficult for a lot of people because like that can be scary, that can be daunting, especially depending where you live. That based on what you look like and how you present, there's a whole number of factors why that can be really I don't want to say risky, but a challenge for people to do. But the reality is that unless you're planning on moving, that's the community you are going to exist within if and when this process starts happening in our lifetime.
And if we think about it, I mean, the process, this is like why your show started. It's like the process is happening like in our lifetime, like right now as we speak, at least for me, I feel like I'm witnessing like the forced like we are being forced to return to some level of like collective reliance for efficiency purposes, for like survival purposes, whatever, because the system is like it's working the way it's supposed to, but for those of us who are under the pyramid structure, like it's crumbling on top of us, right?
Yeah.
And so I think I can't remember if it was your show or if it was I follow this TikTok creator. Her username is Quarantine Wino, and she's a leftist prepper. And I can't remember which one it was where I found like Margaret Killjoy's content. Live like the world is dying. And it's all about this idea that like actually prepping and like for this current or projected like end of the world as we know it, whatever that is, like we 100% will need each other. Like we're gonna need to know like which of our neighbors like we can count on. We're gonna have like we won't be able to like flee to some magical part of the world where like people
Everyone's
are
an
just like
anarchist.
us. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So it's like we're gonna need relationships with the folks around us. And that's like that's the community organizing piece and also the like healing from the trauma of the system that like intentionally keeps us isolated and individualized so that we don't start those relationships and threaten like the status quo of hierarchy and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And that can be really scary, like I said. But and I think this is what Margaret does a really great job of is addressing that reality and, owning her place in that community. And I think that can be a really good model for other people to start thinking about what that looks like. In my own experiences, I feel like, you know, most people who I disagree with politically are not necessarily bad people. And that I think doesn't seem like a radical thing to say, but I do think sometimes when we get in these echo chambers, it does become a really radical thing to say is because my neighbor voted for Trump doesn't mean he wants me dead. And that is just like we have to start someplace. And if that's where the conversation has to begin, like then I'm happy to be the person that is gonna go say that and get a lot of flack for it because that's what I do, I guess. I don't know. People just need to start like talking to their neighbors.
100%. Absolutely. I mean, I'm my whole thing is trauma informed, like healing oriented community organizing. Like community organizing is not in your face direct action. Like you're a bad person or like it's not just turning out during elections, asking folks to go vote like on behalf of a certain candidate, knocking on their door that one time and thinking like it's over and done. It's like, no, it's like walking with each other into healing, because the reason that people are like voting for Trump is because they are in a fight or flight response, right? Like Trump's
Yeah.
really good at being like, here's your fight option. And then people latch onto it because we live under this like really traumatizing and just vitriolic culture. And I've just seen, so I mean, living in Western North Carolina and like I'm like in Madison Cawthorn's district, like I'm in red land out here. And community organizing, like I started in electoral organizing in politics where it was like, oh, we've just got to change the way people vote and then everything will get better. And that's what led me to realizing like, oh no, this is a lot deeper than like the way people vote. This is like how we see and relate to each other. And really what everyone needs is just someone to see them as a human being and like give them the chance to share their story. And then we are able to identify a lot more of like our common ground. And part of what like brought me to this conclusion is like, I'm a far leftist, I'm like anti-capitalist, like anti-fascist, anti-racist. But I grew up here. I was raised by this village, like and not just by one person or like a family unit. My mom was a single mom and I was literally raised by like multiple like people in the community who helped us stay afloat in like my childhood. And for them to then grow up and be the people who are voting for Trump and are being cast out and like written off as like horrible people because of that one vote is just like, it's so contradictory to what I've seen from them and how they've raised me and treated me. And so I just really appreciate that that's like the perspective that you take, because that's it. It's like if we just write folks off, that's still superiority. That's still like contributing to the division. It's just feeding the machine.
Yeah, so I think like just like what you're saying, my family is immigrants, and my dad didn't have his citizenship until I was older, and most of my family still doesn't. Some of them are questionably here legally, and like many of them voted for Trump. And you'd say that you're voting, you're trying to, this is like one of the challenges I see with a lot of folks when we like have these discussions about like intersectionality is how does this engage, how do we talk about these things and look at these different barriers people face? And then how does that fit into a bigger context of capitalism, as opposed to how does capitalism fit into that context? And there's a subtle difference in that conversation that I think the internet as a format in general really struggles with. But also like humanity, like existing as a human being, and like having these conversations and dealing with our neighbors and dealing with our right-wing family and all these things. We have to be better about that nuance. And, a simple example, the one that I kind of rant on a lot on the internet is like the term racism. Like you call someone as a racist, that is a very loaded term, and it can mean a lot of things, right? It can mean somebody who doesn't use the proper nomenclature for 2022. It can mean like they believe in racial superiority, right? So like calling someone a racist isn't really isn't helpful to any discussion. We have to start thinking about how do we break down these terms of racism into more meaningful terms that we can then utilize and leverage for beneficial discussions about if you call someone a racist, they're going to say no. Like very, very few people are going to say, yes, I'm a racist. So if we're throwing that term around and people are like, well, I'm not a racist, I don't think I'm better than XYZ people, then you're not going to have a constructive conversation, right? So just little things like, as much as we're obsessed with language, we're not obsessed with the right language. And we are not willing to embrace the humanity in people that don't think like us. And that is a really big problem, especially getting back to this idea of what does our community look like and what should it look like? And, I have a lot of things I can say about what that should look like, but we can kind of continue on this lens if you want to keep going.
Either direction is fine with me. I'm like, you're getting like, I'm just honestly so pleasantly surprised at like how you're just like tapping right into like exactly essentially like my organizing language and like what I'm always hungry like and like what I'm trying to like get through to people. So I'm like,
Yeah.
like I'm explain this from the bottom up, because that's exactly it. And that's why, so like this learning community that I'm doing, like before we even get to the community organizing stuff of like strategy and tactics and yada yada, the first thing I cover is like Tima Okune's model of what she calls white supremacy culture, but what I call white supremacist capitalism culture, but which like the whole idea is that like our country was literally founded as a corporate shareholder profit venture. Like a bunch of European shareholders like invested in like sending a bunch of poor folks to this new continent to see how they could produce money on behalf of the shareholders. Like that is at the root of everything else that happened after that moment in time. And then from there, they had to like create ways of keeping all of those poor folks from coming together to like organize against this profit venture and this like profit machine. So you have the like concept of race being born, and then you have all of the other isms being born of like ableism, heterosexism, like all of these things that were under this umbrella of like capitalism and assigning value to people based on like their accumulation and like hoarding of wealth. And so just so much appreciate like that. And like you're like touching on like something else, which I haven't talked about a ton on the show yet, but which I'm hope to get to very soon, which is like the idea of cancel culture and like the ways in which we just replicate exactly the things that we like claim to stand against, but we just do it against the people that we deem are no longer valuable based on, it's like under the current machine, we deem that people are they're not valuable if they can't like produce to this like capitalist venture. And then in like the leftist, like liberal machine, we're like replicating the same exact structures, but we're just assigning value to like, do you think like me? Do you explain things the way that I explain things, talk about things the way that I talk about things? And it's the exact same process, the exact same mechanisms. It's just like shifting who we do it to. That's all.
Yeah. And that points to a bigger component for both capitalism and the left that I don't think really gets discussed enough. And that's the overlaps that we see between both like the hyper capitalists supporting people, libertarians, whatever, and the rest of like us on the left is this like this overlap that exists between us and like cults, right? Where a lot of the requirements or how you would define a cult can be very easily applied to people, whether it's their belief in, unflinching belief in capitalism or their unflinching belief in like what is truth or objective, like objectively accurate. And that reality is like, it doesn't work that way. Like we all exist within a lens that is subjective, and we cannot be objective. Objectively doesn't exist, because that is impossible. And therefore it is impossible for us all to see the same way and to view things in the same lens. We can't argue that people can be triggered, but also then say everyone should have the same view on things, because by acknowledging that people can be triggered, you're acknowledging there's a unique experience that is unmatched by other people. And you can't round that square, right? Like that is just the reality of the world, and it's complicated and it's messy, and we want to make it simple and clean and like, framed by like very vague, meaningful bullshit, basically, that doesn't accomplish anything. And instead, like getting that ties into what what I was kind of hinting at before, of this idea of what does community really look like. And community is supposed to be people that don't believe in the same things, right? Like we can't say that we believe in like this idea of like multiculturality, but then exclude people for their political beliefs, as long as those beliefs aren't like impacting you personally, right? Like as long as they're not infringing on your own individual rights. And I will say that very loosely, because I think that has also been poorly understood on the left. But like, I believe that community exists with people that are libertarian, right, and all these other politics. And that is not something, I think the amount of people I've heard agree with me on that is I can count them on one hand. But like, that's the reality. That's what community looks like. Community looks explicitly like not like me. That's how you challenge your ideas. That's how you challenge your perceived perception, your understanding of that absolute truth, right? Which doesn't even really exist, but we try to make it in our heads, where we are the only ones that have found the cure for the way society works, and it's on us to teach everyone this right way to live. And that's just not how the world works. And like, it's so full of ourselves that it's just like, it's insufferable. I wouldn't want to listen to me either. Like, it's bullshit.
Yes, exact. I'm like, have you read Tima Okun's
I have
characteristics?
not. No.
Literally, you're listing them off. Like you're like listing off the characteristics that are in this, like, it's on a website, it's free. But it's like it came from an academic article and like studying but like objectivity is like one of the characteristics of this culture. It's like the idea that things can be objectively measured, or like that there is this like outside objective neutral stance on anything ever. And then also like the one right way of being that you're describing, like there is a right way to think, there is a right way to be, and if we can just show someone else the right way, then they will naturally like adopt it and like come to the right side. And that's just not, that is inherently itself like part of what this machine depends on, because that's what gets us to, like you're saying, like that concept of like disagreement and vulnerability and growth, togetherness, and like rumbling and being okay with not being on the same page all the time. Like that's community. And so this concept that there is one right way of being, like that's part of what the machine depends on, so that we aren't building this community together.
Exactly.
And like, yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I'm just like, oh, I'm so just appreciate like how you're like, I'm just so curious also, like how, considering like this was something that I read the characteristics and then it was like I had taken the whichever pill it is in the Matrix, I don't know. And then it was like, oh, I see it everywhere. But like you've come to these conclusions like on your own. And I'm just so curious if there's like, was that like, are there models for this, like this perspective in your life that you've seen?
No, not really. I've always I came from a trade background, and I just like in my experiences, the model I always talk about, or the experience in particular I've always talked about, is like I worked with a bunch of very like mostly boomer, blue collar, older guys that we would talk, and like they were into a lot of them were into hunting. So this is the example that I like to use, and we'd be talking and they'd be like, it's not like back in the day when like we used to go out hunting and there would always be snow on the ground. There's never snow on the ground during deer season. And I'm like, yeah, that's climate change. And like, no, not that. And it was just like, okay, like you get it. They care about the environment. They'll complain about the pollution happening, and where they used to hunt, and like how the deer aren't as healthy, and like all these things that are happening to these spaces that they care about and that they contribute to these environmental causes, as long as they're framed within their understanding of the world, right? And like they're not my enemy. And that was like trying to figure out, I like you would do anything for me. If I was broken down on the road an hour away, you would stop and come help me out. And like I just know you from work. Like that says something a lot. It says a lot about someone's character, right? So how can I believe that and also believe the logic that a lot of the left pushes, right? That there's no space for me and him just because his politics are different than me. And like that doesn't mean he's a perfect person, but I'm not either, right? Like none of us are. And part of that whole cancel culture is that everyone has to be, right? We all have to be, or then we have to beg for forgiveness, like some like, going to the council for like pleading for our lives. Like it's bullshit. It's insanity. And like I could never get on board with that vision of like what the left should look like. And like as we like worked out this podcast and started fleshing out some of these ideas, it became really apparent to me like a lot of our basis for the entire podcast is on like this concept of complex system science, which is just basically that diversity and specialization make systems stronger, right? The more things that are in there that can help one another, the more chains need to be broken for it to start falling apart. Why wouldn't our communities look like that too, right? Like the more opinions, the more we can get challenged, the more resistance we face, so that we have to check ourselves and our beliefs and our privilege and all these different things, the better off we're going to be and the better off they're going to be, right? And that's why the echo chambers are so dangerous. We're talking about basically inverting this concept of echo chambers, right? Where you don't have a luxury of having an opinion without it being challenged a little bit. So you can at least be like, yeah, that makes sense, or it doesn't pass the sniff test, right? And all, the fact that all these things, you can kind of see these inverse relationships between the bad things we have happening today in the world and what we're propositioning. And you can see pretty quickly that like the fact that the bad things happening are the inverse of the thing that that we want to see in the world means that, in my opinion, that means what we're trying to do, that we're trying to build ecosystems, communities, all these things that are diverse in every meaning of the word. To me, that means we're looking at things the right way, and that is the way forward, right? It's not about all of us being solitary islands of communities. It's about us being a meshing of communities with different beliefs and understandings and perspectives, and we are not going to agree all the time, and that's a good thing. We're not, even within the left, like we don't have to agree all the time, and that's a good thing because we need to be pushed back. And we just haven't figured out how to do that without it like becoming like, I don't trust you or you are my enemy. Like we have to get past that part. Like we're at the little kid stage where they don't know how to play together, and we have to learn how to grow up, and we have to do that really fast.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we have to, I think, stop getting so caught up. I think a lot of what so we've got the like liberal kind of like leftist space that's more of like the like middle class, like the liberal folks who are like Democrats are the answer, and like clearly like people who vote bad are bad. And then you've also got this leftist group that I've only recently discovered because it's like more in digital spaces that I'm because like in my community there's not a ton of leftists, so I don't like see a huge variety. But it's like the folks who cling to like specific like theoretical identity, like I am a communist, I am a Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, like whatever. They're like, it's like they cling to it, and they're like, and if you're not like screw the tankies, screw these guys, like whatever, And for me, it's like I've never even like I know the kind of world I want to live in, and other than that, it's like I don't claim to be any kind of like specific, any political, theoretical, like ideological identity. For me, it's like I believe in exactly like what you're describing. It's like it's more about, for me, it's about human behavior more than anything else.
No.
It's like that's what we need to understand. We don't need to understand the like perfect political like way of revolution. It's like we need to understand people
Yeah.
and like and community. That's it.
Yeah, and that's perfect. Like that, and then we can explore that beyond humanity, right? We can explore that into our ecological communities. We can explore that in the within time, right? Within the
Yes.
time and space of the landscape where we live, right? Where we are thinking about what is right for my place based on the humans that live here, their lived histories, the lived history of this landscape, and where do I fit into that, and what does that look like going into the future? And everything, like the if I were to summarize like what the vision for our podcast would be in a sentence, it would be, how do we figure out how to live in the place and time we are today and where it needs to be in the future? And that's like politics is inherently local. And the joke I make off the record, and you'll be the first person to get to hear it anywhere recorded, is that communists are obsessed with the dead, right? They're obsessed with history. They're obsessed with fighting over the Soviet Union. Anarchists are obsessed with written stuff that doesn't apply to the world that they live. And basically, the argument to read theory is because they don't have a dictatorship of or like a vanguard. Some dead writers are their vanguard. And in my opinion, that's no different, because the argument is basically what has been written and how do we apply that to today? Whereas my response is, what does the community say? And that we apply to the history of that landscape. And that is very different. And literature can, or, theory can be like radicalizing, but it is not the solution. It is just a nexus for people that need it. And not everyone needs it. And people get really uncomfortable when you start saying, no, you don't need to read theory. Frankly, I haven't read theory in a decade, and I don't apply it. I don't think about it. I think it can be a useful tool, but like, no one gives a shit. Like, you do not go to Food Not Bombs and like guide your principles based on like Murray Bookchin or some bullshit. Like, it's not how the fucking real world works. And like, people need to get off the internet and realize that.
Exactly. Exactly. It's like community organizing. You literally can't read books and learn how to community organize. Like you've got to like go out and like organize and then like learn from the experience. And like I personally have literally never read, like I've never read any political theory like Marx's or Engels, like any of that stuff. Like, but I have read like, again, like my background being in like social work, like I've read human behavioral theory and like this concept, like what I want organizers to be learning about is like the ecological like systems, like the systems theory that like you bring into your show. And then I want them to learn about like the concept of like motivational interviewing, which is like what I use every day, where I'm like, instead of just having conversations with people where I'm like going to debate with them, it's like, how do I have this intentional conversation where I motivate them to like see the world differently through their own experiences and like step into their power through that way, and like then bring them into this journey with me so that we can continue expanding and rippling out in that like exponential scaling effect and the same thing that you're trying to do. And so yeah, just if anyone ends up listening to this and like is wanting to read any kind of theory, like let's look at something completely different and actually like understand how we work together as like people, as planet, as like everything in between, and like how we are literally interconnected. And that's one of the cultural pieces too of this, like the culture TM that like holds us all down, is like this disconnection from, like, I feel like that's what it all comes down to. It's like disconnecting us from ourselves, disconnecting us from each other, like disconnecting us from our planet and like our environment, disconnecting us from our history. Like that, it's just like pulling, like when you're like pulling roots like up from the ground when you're like weeding that garden and whatever it is. And like it all just comes down to disconnection.
Yeah, that's really what it comes down to, is like, do you know your neighbors? Because they're a lot less scary, just like you are a lot less scary than Fox News says you are. And like that's okay. And like we all end up spending too much time on the internet or whatever, but get out of it and like go experience those things. And if you are an anarchist or communist or whatever, then like inherently you should believe in the power of your community. So why are you not engaging with it? And like that's not to say like go knock on like the guy that's like an like open like white supremacist door, but like use some common sense, obviously. But like if you believe in community, that means like all of it or 99% of it, right? Like community is the people you don't like too. And that's uncomfortable because we are so able to get away from that today. But that has not historically been the case. And, you know, part of that is that we don't have these like third spaces, right? We have home, we have work. And historically, there's been third spaces. We don't have that today except the internet. But because of the echo chamber effect of social media, we don't really like meaningfully have those third spaces. And that's something I think, you know, the right often has like the church, right? That's a third space for their community. The left, we don't really have that alternative, right? And that's where I think like ecology should be that. Our community building should be that, through something we can collectively enjoy and improve and make our community better and beautify our community, something that's visible to people that are not involved with it, right? So like the church, part of what they do isn't just about building community internally and holding people accountable, but also the outreach piece, right? The PR. At the end of the day, like food, you know, donating food and all these things, those are PR campaigns by churches, right? We need to do the same thing. And that means we need to go into communities. We need to work to restore landscapes and show that humans have a place in the ecology and that we have a place, our communities have a place, all of us, not just the people that can identify the Latin names of all the plants that they see and which ones are invasive, but every single person has a place in that ecological community. And we need to welcome people from you know, all different perspectives to see what we can do together and to create that network within our communities where we're not these scary people that the right might think we are, and conversely that they're not these scary people we think they are.
Yeah. Like the and like so much of the fear that you're naming, it's like one, like fear of the other, but also fear of like going back to the concept of cancel culture, like fear of ourselves being like rejected or exiled, because there's no rejection under this culture that isn't violent and like
Yeah.
isn't painful and extreme. And so it's like it's made to be intentionally scary, like, and bring up a lot of fear for all of us. And so like if we can like, for like folks who are held back by like, just like, if they're able to like recognize like, this isn't my fear, like this is a fear that has been handed to me and like taught to me on purpose in order to like keep me from achieving joy, keep me from achieving connection. And I love that like this idea that you just named about like that third space, like that is the part that's so missing too from like what we see as like movement or social justice activity work today. Like the what's the almost like rituals coming to mind, but that's like not quite what I'm looking for. But that space of like just joy and being together, potlucks, right? Like I think about like when I was
Yeah.
growing up, potlucks were a thing, like the
Like the
square
congregation,
dancing.
like
Yeah,
whatever it is, like
exactly.
non-denominational congregation.
Yeah. And like the
Yeah.
cultural, like traditional, like just engagement for the purpose of like engagement and like
Yeah. Community, just
community.
community. And
Yeah.
like that is fundamentally missing, right? And social media, suburbanism, there's all these facets to why that's become the case and how that's become so normalized, right? Like in no time in human history have we ever been so alienated. Like, erase the whole capitalist problem, right? Even if we did not live under a capitalist system, we would all still be incredibly depressed and have all these issues because, like, we're entirely alienated from human touch, from human beings. And when we think about our ability to physically relate to one another, it's just like we walk on eggshells around one another with the language we use, with our, the way we care for one another. It's just like this is not how humans have ever existed in history, and we're surprised that like we're not healthy. Like our
Yeah.
society is not healthy. We are not healthy. Like our ecosystem is not healthy. Like these are not, we always talk about like, yeah, the problem is capitalism, but like, yeah, here we are talking about the problem stems from capitalism, but like it's very fundamental to who we are. These are not disparate issues that we can fundamentally just blame on capitalism as a whole, like as a specific thing, but this concept of community itself that we fundamentally don't have in not just a human sense, but a transhuman sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And seeing ourselves as like inherently connected to the that's such a, like an something that I personally at least associate with a lot of like indigenous wisdom was like this like we like the recognition of like the interconnectedness with the earth that sustains them and like needing to shepherd that in the same way that we like are nurtured by it, having to nurture it. And yeah, and just like that again back to the disconnection of like everything and even disconnecting ourselves from recognizing our own need for that connection with the land and like how it enabled us to thrive as like people. I'm so curious, like outside of the show, like I know you mentioned you do your homesteading and engage, you have like all of your animals. Like what are some of the ways that you're kind of trying to model or embody this community creation outside of the show?
Yeah, so I'm involved with a couple of projects unrelated to the show. A couple food pantries that I work with and try to like build relations with the community. Other, more formal, like conventional agricultural type nonprofits that are in that space. I also do some work with some indigenous groups that do landscape restoration. So that's been really fulfilling to build those relationships and get some really interesting perspective from elders who may not particularly articulate the same things that tend to be all over social media, which has been really insightful and validating for me, which has been really great. We also, with the podcast, have built out a Discord, and that's been the goal has been with that to create meaningful communities. Basically, like what we're talking about with guerrilla agriculture or guerrilla gardening, trying to build like native plant nurseries across the country that are based on local ecotypes and making that like community efforts for folks that live in those areas, with the goal of building inroads in particular around this concept of we all care for the ecosystem, and how do we build inroads into those communities like right-wing libertarians who hunt and care about these things, and get them to, you'll talk to a lot of hunters and they will recognize the value of native species, but they don't go out and say, I'm going to do something about it. Sometimes they do. They'll plant trees, but they don't do a lot of the clearing of the old stuff or the invasive stuff. Or if they do, it's a one-time deal, a lot of times with chemicals, but walking them through the value of like thinking about it as a relational process instead of I'm going to, go into this with the idea of just destroying the bad thing and like it'll all work out because I got rid of the bad thing. Like this very like abstract understanding of this relationship with the ecosystem. So ultimately the goal is to like start building those inroads, provide resources for people that want to do cool stuff like guerrilla agriculture, guerrilla gardening, working to do, ecosystem restoration. Ultimately the big picture is to kind of think about how can we make this a sustainable model? How can we subvert things like the way social media wants to manipulate us to make money, to make them do free advertising for us. Just being aware of the system as it exists and trying to play with that model for our benefit and trying to build those inroads as much as we can. So it's like a very long and convoluted and messy process of a million different things where nothing is getting done as well as it should, but it's kind of like whatever comes out and seems to be working the best is where the energy will then eventually get refocused the most. But there's only so much time in the day, right?
Exactly. It's all an experiment. We're like unlearning and creating new ways of learning like simultaneously. And so it's a very messy process just by nature. I'm like, I've got this like situation in my head where I'm like, okay, I live in this apartment complex. I do know a good number of my neighbors. I'm like, I do try to do, kind of like potlucky stuff and like create some kind of sense of community around like the community organizing stuff that I do. But I'm like, if I wanted to now insert some ecological, like environmental aspect to this within my like apartment complex and like community here, or if there's someone out there who's like in a similar situation and they're like, oh, well, I have this kind of like this group of people who are local to me that I have been building relationships with, like what, and who has no background knowledge whatsoever and like ecology and like permaculture, etc. Like what is like the simplest kind of way for someone in like my shoes or a similar boat to just like try and dig into including like this layer into our community's relationships?
Sure. So I think for a lot of people, there's like something as simple as like a community garden, right? Almost every city's got a community garden someplace. Depending where you live, it's really hard or really easy to get into that. If it's really easy, great, go do some cool stuff. If for folks that are listening when this comes out, it's probably too late to harvest any seed heads, but just getting something like the what's it called? Of course, I'm going to blank on it right now. The iNaturalist app for your phone, and go outside in the spring and start taking pictures of plants, and it'll tell you what it is, and then you can start to figure out, is this native, is this invasive? One of the things for me when I'd always been around gardening and like I was pretty familiar with like food plants, but I wasn't really familiar with like, and I'll say food like conventional food plants, but like I wasn't as familiar with non-conventional food plants. So getting to know those, and like you identify one, and on a hike you just look for that everywhere, and then that one, and then next time you go pick another one, and then next time you might go and you're like, huh, that one looks very similar to this other one, and you're like, oh, this is witch hazel, it looks very similar to hazelnut, and now these two differences, and then you start do a little bit more researching. Oh, one of these likes to be near water, so that means if I'm seeing this instead of that, then I'm near, like the water table must be higher. What else is in a high water table area? And it just slowly snowballs into, understanding what plants are usually together, right? They're in community, just like we are in community. And that's not like, some like hippy dippy kind of like thing. Like, no, they all require the same ecological conditions, and having evolved in that space together, they do better together and make each other better. And then when these invasives come in, they cause problems, but that's a whole other conversation. But that's the way to start thinking about, how do I relate with this ecosystem? How do I see these plants as cousins and family? And how do I relate to them and understand them within a greater context and have more appreciation for them. And once you start to understand what's there, you start to notice, I saw where all these sugar maples were. There was this other plant. I don't think you guys have sugar maples where you are, but like I noticed where all the white pines are. There was a lot of white oaks. How come there's no white oaks here? And you might find out that's because that site's been clear cut a number of times. So what can you do to improve that site? You can bring in some white oaks, right? You can go and the second you recognize what a white oak nut acorn looks like. Can't believe I just said nut. What a white acorn looks like, you can go harvest them and plant them in your apartment and, put them in a little solo cup and put them on the patio. And, as long as the squirrels don't get it, like you can go plant 100 white oak trees and like you have your friends come out. And if people stop by, explain to them what you're doing. And suddenly everyone that's involved and sees it has a better understanding of that ecosystem and what it should look like and how we can make it better, as opposed to thinking I need to step back and let nature do its thing. I don't know what I'm doing. Nature does. Well, it's more complicated than that. We do belong in nature. We need to think about what that looks like. And it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be very simple as just observing and realizing when something looks wrong. So I don't know if that helped at all or not.
That did help. It helped a ton. And if I did want to start like a community garden, not thinking about like the logistical piece of it, because that's like a whole separate, like what are the hoops that you got to jump through and like where can you do it, that kind of thing. But like the piece of like, then what are the things to consider when planting a community garden, like beyond just like tomatoes, like cucumber, like instead of just like going to Lowe's and buying like a bunch of seed packets, like what are some of the ways to incorporate like the kind of like piece of relating to the land that and like the process of what we're doing a little bit deeper.
So one of the first and easiest things to do is start thinking about what has grown in that landscape in the past couple hundred years. So what belongs there, and that doesn't necessarily need to be perennials. Or it doesn't need to be like woody perennials. It can be things like evening primrose, which have a number of benefits, have a really useful oil, have roots that you can eat. There's a number of different things you can do with that plant, and it also hosts a number of native insects, right? So you can look at something like that, or any other species that belongs in our ecosystem that has a lot of value for human consumption. What are some traditional annual crops people grew where you live? For most of us, like corn is a very big one, but corn has only been in like the eastern part of the United States, northeastern, about from where you are up, for the last, like, it was only here for a couple hundred years before colonists showed up. So like historically speaking, it was a new food for this region. And there's a bunch of other annuals that people were eating in these areas that we don't think of as food crops anymore. And starting to explore what that looks like and what those are, and what we can do to not necessarily, I don't want to say like bring them back like they need to be brought back, but maybe integrating them a little bit more, looking at how the food systems were designed in these landscapes, that's more in alignment with the natural flow of the ecosystem, right? And that's going to look different for everyone wherever you are, and that requires some research. It requires like accepting that you're gonna fail, because like what you're trying to do is very complicated in the sense of it's totally outside of how we think about growing food. But I think it's really important for us to get humbled by that, as opposed to, like you said, you go to Lowe's and you buy a bag of Miracle Grow soil mix and some tomato plants, and as long as they don't dry out, you're going to have like a bunch of tomatoes. Like there's not a lot to it, right? So going out and actually thinking about these systems in a bigger, more comprehensive way is going to be more challenging. And I think most people walk away being more fully appreciative of both where their food comes from and also how food was traditionally grown and how in tune people were to those local ecosystems.
Yeah, so much about like I like what I'm taking away is just so much of a reframe from an extractive mindset of like what can I get out of this to like a regenerative mindset, to being just like what can I also be putting in like back into the the land and like the area around me that I'm in addition to like getting out of it.
Yeah, and that's why I don't spend a lot of time, and I really appreciate other folks that don't spend a lot of time talking about foraging, because like foraging is inherently extractive. There's not many foragers that are talking about how do you have more ramps in the woods? Like, what are you doing to increase the things you're harvesting, right? And that's where I disagree with a lot of modern or like pop foraging cultures, because it is that extractive relationship and not a reciprocative. I don't think that's the right word, a real word. A reciprocating relationship, right? And like there, it might not seem like a huge deal, but it is. That's why our forests are not quote unquote food forests, right? Because people haven't had that reciprocation in that relationship, and that is really fundamental to what it is to be human.
So much so. Have you, speaking of foragers, have you looked at any of Appalachian foragers' content?
Is that a specific person or?
Yeah. If you, so what I appreciate about her is one, she's like teaching people how to forage in a way that is respectful. So like always being mindful of like, don't, if you see like, bunches, like take a little bit from like multiple bunches as opposed to like pulling up an entire like system of like, or like family connection of plants or however you would say it. But then she also talks about doing exactly what you're saying. Like she has like a whole pawpaw forest that she's like planted from after she's like foraged pawpaws for so long. And then she got land, got access to land that she was able to like then go and like plant pawpaw seeds on like all throughout and similar will plant her own, like she teaches folks how to make oyster mushrooms grow essentially in like laundry baskets so that you're
Oh
not
yeah, I've
like
seen
always
that.
having to
Yeah.
like go out and forage, but like hey, once you like know what these look like, then like we can learn how to take care of them, etc. And so I just really appreciate her content, and as you were talking about that, I was like, oh yeah, that's something that I've noticed not every forager does equally.
Yeah, I'll plug Sam Thayer too. He's very big on, he's done a lot of research on dispelling some myths about plant growth, which has been really great. And I think will be really something that will guide a lot of this kind of stewardship moving forward into the future. So for folks that are just getting into foraging, highly recommend check out Sam Thayer's books. He's really good, very thorough. I think he's on TikTok. He's not really on other social media, but go check out his stuff.
Similar Appalachian foragers mostly on TikTok that I know of. So if you go to check her out, that's where you'll find her. And speaking of, where can we find you?
You can find us on Instagram at Prole's Almanac. One thing we're working on building out is, as we were talking, is like providing a very easy to access framework for if you're trying to get into this stuff and you don't know where to begin. We have what's called PPA sites, and it's basically we took the design of um, like the National Forestry content and just basically mimicked it with a Prole's PPA site sign, so people that are doing guerrilla gardening can go. The stickers are like $2. Just buy the stand, stick it on there. If you shove it in the woods a little bit, it looks like it's a national whatever. No one's going to question it. And you can, the idea is that you can find places that are like between lots or whatever. The idea isn't like you're going to go do an acre. It's like finding that weird corner that no one cares about and is full of invasives. What can you do to restore it? Thinking about those things. And then the PPA sites is on Instagram, at least, is basically breaking out each ecoregion and then highlighting the plants that are there and their value, the layering of it, and trying to understand the full, if I have these 3 or 4 trees, what are the understory trees that I should find in those places if I want to plant flowers or whatever it might be. So that is PPA sites, and again, the regular website or Instagram is Prole's Almanac, and wherever you're listening to this, you can probably listen to us.
Amazing. I'll link to all of that stuff in the show notes. So folks can find you. I'm also going to be checking out PPA sites. Very exciting. And is there anything else? I want to be respectful of your time. I know we've been together like a little bit over an hour, but is there anything else that you were hoping to touch on today that like we didn't surface?
I don't think so. I think we covered far more than I expected.
Awesome. Great. That's what I love to hear. Thank you so much, Andy. This has really been a pleasure. Like, definitely one of, at least for me, the just like all of my interviews resonate, but this just resonated on levels that are like I don't get to talk about very often. I talk about them in my solo episodes because I'm like trying to get this thread to pull through and become clear to folks. But in interviews, it tends to be a little less clear and direct, and so I'm just so appreciative. Thanks so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Rednecks Rising podcast. But that's not all we got in store for you this week. We've got one more episode dropping today and another bonus episode headed your way to hold y'all through dealing with all of the family shenanigans. Let's just keep it at that, shall we? I hope y'all have a restful, restorative, and reconnecting holiday week. And we'll see y'all next week, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise. But before we go, we gotta know, what's the answer to this week's trivia question?
Hey, Chelsea. So our trivia question this week was, when did Bill Mollinson and David Holmgren coin the phrase permaculture? The year was 1978.